I am Joshua, 32, and my own brother kicked me out of our family dinner table because I was adopted, then stuck me with the $3,270 bill. Before I tell you how I ended up owning everything they ever valued, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The clinking of crystal glasses and the low, sophisticated hum of conversation filled the upscale downtown restaurant. The air smelled of expensive roasted meats, truffles, and aged wine. It was supposed to be a celebration for my parents' 30th wedding anniversary. I had worked a brutal 12-hour shift that day at the firm. I had just earned a major promotion, something I had bled and sweat for over the last 4 years, but nobody at that table cared. I rushed over in my best suit because my mother, Elizabeth, demanded I be there to make their family portrait look complete for her country club friends. I sat at the very edge of the massive mahogany table. I kept my elbows tucked in. I ate my food quietly. That was the golden rule I had learned to live by since I was a child. Do not take up space. Make yourself invisible. My older brother, Carter, sat right at the head of the table next to my parents, Matthew and Elizabeth. Carter was the biological son, the golden child. He always wore clothes that cost more than my monthly rent, and he always had that smug, entitled look plastered across his face. He was swirling a glass of expensive red wine, holding court, telling some exaggerated story about his latest golf trip. Everyone was hanging on his every word. Suddenly, Carter stopped mid-sentence. He leaned forward, looking right past my parents, and locked his eyes on me. A cruel little smile played on his lips. "Joshua," Carter said. His voice was loud, way too loud. It cut straight through the chatter of the nearby tables. "You know, this table is getting a little cramped. My elbows are bumping into Dad. Why don't you go find another table? This one's for actual family, not adopted boys." My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. The restaurant seemed to go completely silent. The ambient noise just vanished. I looked at my mother, Elizabeth. I thought just this once, she might say something. She might defend me. Instead, she covered her mouth with her manicured hand and let out a soft, amused giggle. My father, Matthew, just chuckled, picked up his scotch, and patted Carter on the back. Not a single person at that table stood up for me. They all laughed. They all agreed. My jaw clamped shut so tight my teeth ached. My ears started ringing. I could feel the stares of strangers burning into the side of my face. The humiliation was like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I didn't say a single word. I carefully placed my silver fork down on the porcelain plate. I stood up, pushing my chair back slowly so it wouldn't make a sound. I didn't look back as I walked away. I walked over to a small, empty, dimly lit table near the bar. I sat down with my back straight, staring at the polished wood in front of me, gripping my glass of ice water until my knuckles turned white. I sat there for over an hour. I watched them order massive seafood towers. I watched them pop bottles of champagne. I watched them laugh and celebrate their perfect, flawless family. When they finally finished, a young waiter named Samuel walked over to their table with the heavy leather checkbook. Carter didn't even acknowledge him. He didn't reach for his wallet. He just pointed a finger directly across the restaurant toward me. Samuel looked terrified. He walked slowly over to my little table in the corner. He couldn't even meet my eyes. He gently placed the leather folder in front of me. "I'm so sorry, sir," Samuel whispered, his voice shaking a little. I opened the folder. The number staring back at me was $3,270. They had ordered the most expensive items on the menu knowing I would be the one forced to pay. My hands started to shake. That was almost an entire month of my salary. I had been saving that money for months to fix the leaking roof on my house. But I refused to let Carter see me break. I refused to give them the satisfaction of a scene. I pulled out my credit card, placed it in the folder, and handed it back to Samuel. I smiled, took a sip of my ice water, and humbly paid the bill. I signed the receipt, feeling a piece of my soul just completely shatter. I was done. I was ready to walk out those doors and never look back. But then, a voice cut through the dining room. It was sharp, authoritative, and echoed off the high ceilings. Just a moment, please. I turned around. So did Carter. So did my parents. Aunt Beatrice, my father's older sister, was standing at the entrance of the private dining area. She was 78 years old, leaning heavily on a silver-handled cane. Aunt Beatrice was the absolute matriarch of the family. She controlled the largest shares of the family estate and the primary inheritance. She walked slowly toward Carter's table. Every step of her cane on the hardwood floor sounded like a judge's gavel. Click, clack, click, clack. Carter's smug smile vanished instantly. He sat up straight, suddenly looking like a terrified little boy caught stealing candy. Aunt Beatrice? Elizabeth stammered, her voice shaking as she stood up so fast she nearly knocked over her water glass. We didn't think you were coming. We thought your health. Sit down, Elizabeth, Beatrice commanded. She didn't yell, but the sheer, cold authority in her tone made my mother drop back into her chair like a stone. Beatrice turned her piercing, icy gaze to Carter. I have sat back and watched this pathetic display for entirely too long. I sat in the corner booth over there and watched you humiliate your brother. I watched you treat him like garbage while you gorged yourselves on his dime. He's not my real brother, Carter muttered defensively, refusing to make eye contact. Beatrice struck her cane against the floor. The sound cracked like a whip. He is 10 times the man you will ever be, Carter. I met with my lawyer yesterday. I signed a new will. The entire table froze. Matthew's face turned completely white. All the color drained from his cheeks. Every property, every company, every single share of my inheritance belongs to Joshua, Beatrice declared, her voice echoing perfectly in the silent restaurant. None of you will inherit a single dime. You are cut off. Carter's expensive wine glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor. Red wine pooled like blood on the polished wood. Elizabeth gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been physically shot. Matthew opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. I sat at my table by the bar, completely paralyzed. My heart was pounding against my ribs. You would think I felt victorious. You would think I wanted to jump up and cheer. But I didn't. A cold, heavy shiver ran down my spine. I knew these people. I knew what they were capable of when their money, their image, and their status were threatened. The storm wasn't over. It was just gathering strength. To understand why this moment shattered every rule our family ever had, and why they hated me so deeply, you have to know how they molded me into a ghost for the past 30 years. I was adopted when I was just 2 years old, right after my biological parents passed away in a horrific car accident. Matthew and Elizabeth took me in. On paper, it looked like a beautiful, selfless act of charity. They played the role of the generous, wealthy family perfectly. In reality, behind closed doors, it was a completely different story. I grew up in a massive, beautiful suburban home with manicured lawns and grand staircases. But my world was confined to the smallest, coldest room in the unfinished basement. It always smelled faintly of damp earth, mildew, and old cardboard boxes. Upstairs, Carter had a room the size of a master suite, filled with the latest video games, expensive clothes, and sports trophies he barely earned. Every single day was a calculated reminder of my place. If we sat down for dinner at home, I was served last. If we took a family photo for the annual Christmas cards, I was always positioned slightly to the side, almost out of frame, making it easy to crop me out later. I wore Carter's hand-me-downs. My shirts were always stretched out at the collar, and my jeans were always frayed at the hems. Whenever I asked why I couldn't join the expensive summer camps Carter went to, or why my clothes had holes in them, Elizabeth would just sigh dramatically. She would cross her arms, look at me with absolute disdain, and deliver the same line. Joshua, stop being so demanding, she would say, her voice dripping with annoyance. You should just be grateful you have a roof over your head at all. Do you know where you would be without us? You'd be on the streets. That phrase became the heavy chain around my neck. Be grateful you have a roof. It was designed to keep my head bowed. They didn't want a second son. They wanted a prop. They wanted an audience for their golden child. I learned to be invisible. I learned to excel in school quietly. I read books in the dark with a cheap flashlight. I built my own internal world where their cruel opinions couldn't reach me. As a kid, I was desperate for their love. But as I grew older, that desperation turned into a hard, quiet armor. The real difference between us became undeniably, painfully clear on Carter's 16th birthday. The driveway was filled with guests, neighbors, and extended family. There were balloons, catered food, the works. Matthew led Carter out to the front yard, covering his eyes with his hands. When he pulled his hands away, everyone cheered. Sitting right there on the pavement was a brand new, midnight blue Porsche. Carter screamed. He jumped up and down, hugging my parents. Everyone clapped. I stood alone on the front porch, watching the sunlight bounce off the polished hood of that luxury sports car. I wasn't even jealous of the car itself. I was jealous of the way my father looked at him. He looked at Carter with total pride, with unconditional love, a look I had never, ever received. Later that same afternoon, the sky opened up. A massive, freezing rainstorm hit the neighborhood. I had an after-school job at a local hardware store. I was working minimum wage, trying to save up for my own college fund, because Matthew had made it crystal clear they wouldn't pay a single dime for my higher education. My sneakers had massive holes in the soles. I had asked Elizabeth for a new pair of cheap $20 shoes the week before, but she told me money was too tight. I walked 3 miles home in the freezing, pouring rain. By the time I got to the back door of the house, I was shivering uncontrollably. My feet were completely numb and soaking wet. I slipped quietly through the kitchen, praying not to be seen. Maria, our old housekeeper, was standing by the sink washing dishes. She took one look at me, and her eyes immediately filled with tears. She didn't say a word. She just quickly grabbed a thick, warm towel from the dryer and wrapped it tightly around my shoulders. She pressed a hot mug of tea into my freezing hands and rubbed my back. Maria knew. She saw everything. She saw the cruelty. But she was just an employee, terrified of losing her salary, so she could never speak up. The only actual family member who ever truly looked at me was Aunt Beatrice. She rarely visited, but when she did, she watched everything with sharp, calculating eyes. When I graduated high school as valedictorian, Matthew and Elizabeth didn't even bother to show up. They were busy attending a minor weekend tennis tournament for Carter. I walked across that stage, holding my diploma, looking out into a sea of proud parents, knowing mine weren't there. But as I walked off the stage, I saw a woman standing by the bleachers. It was Aunt Beatrice. She walked up to me and handed me a heavy, leather-bound book. She looked me dead in the eye, her voice cutting through the noise of the cheering crowd. "You don't need anyone to grant you worth, Joshua," she said firmly. "You will build it yourself." I held onto those words for the next 14 years. I put myself through college. I built my career from the ground up. I moved out the very second I could afford a cheap apartment. I thought I had escaped them. I thought the past was just a bad memory I could bury. But as I sat in my apartment the morning after that disastrous restaurant dinner, listening to my phone buzz, I realized the past was about to violently collide with my present. The morning after Beatrice's dramatic announcement at the restaurant, my phone practically exploded. It vibrated across my kitchen counter like a possessed machine. I stared at the glowing screen. 52 missed calls. Countless text messages. The notification icon just kept ticking up. I took a deep breath and opened the first text from Carter. It was a massive wall of furious, misspelled words. "You think you won? You manipulated an old woman. You're nothing but a stray dog we took in. This charade won't hold, Joshua. I'm getting a lawyer today. We are taking you to court and taking everything back." I set the phone down, rubbing my temples. A few minutes later, it rang again. It was Elizabeth. Against my better judgment, my deeply ingrained habit of obedience kicked in, and I answered. "Joshua," she said immediately. She was crying, but it wasn't real crying. It was that high-pitched, perfectly manufactured sob she used whenever she wanted sympathy from her country club friends. "Joshua, how could you do this to us? Your father hasn't slept all night. Carter is absolutely devastated. You know Beatrice is losing her mind. She's sick. You need to call her lawyer right now and refuse the inheritance. It's the only decent thing to do after everything we've provided for you all these years. I squeezed the phone. My knuckles turned white. The old Joshua, the scared little boy in the damp basement, wanted to apologize. He wanted to fix it. He wanted to make the yelling stop. But I looked down at my hands. These were the hands that built my life. These were the hands that paid a $3,270 bill for people who openly laughed at my humiliation. I didn't ask her for anything, Elizabeth, I said. My voice was completely steady. It was entirely void of emotion. And I'm not fixing your mess. I hung up. I blocked her number. I blocked Matthew. I blocked Carter. I drew a hard line in the sand. But I severely underestimated how dirty they were willing to play to get their hands back on that money. By Tuesday, the local tabloids had picked up the story. My family had deep social connections, and they were using every single one of them to destroy me. I walked past a newsstand on my way to work and saw my own face staring back at me from the front page of a gossip magazine. The headline read, "Adopted son snatches fortune. Master manipulator or greedy gold digger." Carter had hired Wyatt, a notorious private investigator known for digging through trash and hacking emails. Paparazzi started following me. They snapped photos of me buying groceries, taking out the trash, walking into my office building. Every mundane action was twisted and weaponized to make me look like a calculating, cold-hearted villain. That evening, there was a heavy knock on my apartment door. I looked through the peephole. It was my cousin, Dylan. Dylan and I had always been somewhat friendly. He was the only one in the extended family who ever bothered to invite me out for a beer. He was currently going through an incredibly nasty divorce and fighting a brutal custody battle for his 2 young kids. I opened the door, exhausted, just grateful to see a friendly face. "Man, they are really putting you through the ringer," Dylan said, shaking his head and holding up a 6-pack of beer. We sat on my couch for over 2 hours. I let my guard down. I poured my heart out. I told him how much that dinner hurt. I told him how I just wanted to be left alone, how I never cared about the inheritance money. I just wanted the respect I never got. Dylan nodded sympathetically, patting my shoulder, telling me I was a good guy and to stay strong. The very next morning, my phone buzzed with a breaking news alert. It was a leaked article on a major gossip site featuring an anonymous family source. I read the article, and my blood ran completely cold. The article quoted my exact words from the night before, but heavily edited and taken completely out of context to make me sound arrogant and unhinged. The source claimed I was celebrating the destruction of my family and laughing at their pain. I stared at the screen. My chest tightened so hard I couldn't breathe. Dylan, he sold me out. He needed massive amounts of cash for his custody lawyer, and Carter had paid him off to get inside my apartment and record me. I gripped the edge of my kitchen counter, the betrayal burning like battery acid in my stomach. Later that afternoon, the final blow landed. I turned on the TV. Carter was sitting on the plush couch of Julian's popular daytime national talk show. Carter was wearing a conservative suit, wiping away fake tears with a tissue. "He's destroying our family, Julian," Carter choked out, looking directly into the camera with perfect, practiced agony. "My aunt is very sick. She's not in her right mind. Joshua preyed on her weakness to steal what rightfully belongs to our family. We just want to save her from him. He's a monster." I clicked the TV off. The silence in my apartment was deafening. I felt like I was suffocating in a room full of thick smoke. They were controlling the entire narrative. They were painting me as a predator. But then my phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Joshua," the voice on the other end said. It was deep, calm, and highly professional. "My name is David. I am Beatrice's attorney. She needs to see you at the estate immediately. It's time." I drove up the long, winding, tree-lined driveway to Aunt Beatrice's massive estate. The house was imposing, built of gray stone, sitting quietly at the top of a hill. I parked my car, my hands sweating against the steering wheel. I was led inside and down a long hallway by a private nurse. The air inside the house smelled strongly of lavender and clinical antiseptic. Beatrice was sitting in a high-backed leather chair by the massive bay window in her private study. A thick wool blanket was draped over her lap. She looked significantly smaller than she had at the restaurant just days ago. Her skin was pale, and her breathing was shallow and labored. She was fighting stage 4 pancreatic cancer, and the reality was, she didn't have much time left. Standing next to her was David, a tall man in a sharp gray suit with a no-nonsense, piercing demeanor. "Sit down, Joshua," Beatrice said softly. Her voice was weaker, yes, but her eyes were still ablaze with that familiar, terrifying fire. I sat down in the chair across from her. David stepped forward and slid a heavy, incredibly thick manila folder across the polished mahogany desk toward me. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to touch it. For years, I suspected Matthew and Elizabeth were hiding something, Beatrice said, leaning forward slightly. "I knew they didn't love you. I knew they treated you poorly. But I always thought it was just standard cruelty and favoritism. I didn't realize it was an active cover-up." I frowned, looking from Beatrice to David. "A cover-up? A cover-up for what?" David tapped the thick folder with his index finger. "Open it, Joshua." I reached out and flipped open the heavy cover. The very first page was a faded legal document from 30 years ago. I read the header. It was a trust fund agreement. It was established by my biological parents right before they died. Following their tragic funeral, this document had been executed. "When your parents passed away, Joshua," David explained gently, adjusting his glasses, "they left behind a substantial life insurance policy and designated savings entirely for your care, your education, and your future. The total amount left to you was $600,000. My heart stopped. The entire room started to spin. I grabbed the edges of the desk to steady myself. $600,000? But Elizabeth always said I was a massive financial burden. They made me pay for my own clothes. I worked minimum wage jobs. I took out massive student loans for college. They told me I had nothing." "I know," Beatrice said, a single tear slipping down her wrinkled cheek. "Keep looking, Joshua. Look at the ledgers." I turned the pages. My hands were shaking so violently I almost tore the delicate paper. I was looking at decades of bank statements, notarized signatures, and massive wire transfer logs. Matthew and Elizabeth had been legally appointed as the executors of my trust when I was a toddler. Over the course of 20 years, they had systematically, quietly drained every single penny out of that account. I saw a withdrawal for $45,000. Right next to it, David had attached a corresponding receipt for a massive luxury kitchen renovation at their house. I saw a withdrawal for $80,000. Attached was a receipt for Carter's elite private university tuition. I saw withdrawals for luxury European vacations, designer clothes, and their expensive country club memberships. And then, my breath caught in my throat. I turned to a page from 16 years ago, a massive single withdrawal for $92,000. Attached to it was the bill of sale from a luxury auto dealership. The purchaser's name was Matthew. The item was a midnight blue Porsche 911. I stopped breathing. The Porsche, Carter's glorious 16th birthday present. The car they paraded in front of the neighborhood. The day I walked 3 miles in the freezing rain with holes in my shoes, shivering until my lips turned blue. They had just bought their golden child a luxury sports car using the money my dead parents left for me to survive. A sound tore out of my throat. It wasn't a cry. It was a deep, guttural growl of absolute, unadulterated rage. I slammed the folder shut. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet study. 30 years of feeling worthless. 30 years of apologizing for existing. 30 years of being told to be grateful for a roof they paid for with my own money. "They didn't just abuse you, Joshua," Beatrice whispered fiercely, gripping the armrests of her chair. "They stole your life to build theirs. They built their entire foundation on your stolen future. And I absolutely refuse to leave this earth letting them get away with it. I looked up at David. My vision was blurry with rage. Carter is suing me to invalidate the will. Yes, David said calmly. They filed the paperwork this morning. They are arguing undue influence and mental incompetence on Beatrice's part. They want to force a settlement. I stood up. I walked over to the massive window, looking out at the sprawling grounds of the estate. The scared, compliant little boy in the basement was dead. He died the exact moment I saw that Porsche receipt. A cold, absolute clarity washed over my entire body. I turned back to them. We aren't settling. We aren't backing down. We let them take us to court. We expose every single page of this folder to the judge, to the media, to the world. Beatrice smiled. It was a fierce, proud, terrifying smile. That's my boy. 6 weeks later, I walked up the wide concrete steps of the downtown courthouse. The morning air was thick and heavy with tension. Paparazzi and reporters swarmed the entrance, flashing cameras in my face, shouting questions, calling me a gold digger and a manipulator. I ignored them all. I kept my head high, walking alongside David, while gently pushing Aunt Beatrice in her wheelchair. We entered the grand, wood-paneled courtroom. Carter, Matthew, and Elizabeth were already seated at the plaintiff's table. They looked like the perfect picture of wealthy elegance and victimhood. Matthew wore a bespoke tailored suit. Elizabeth dabbed her dry eyes with a delicate lace handkerchief. Carter shot me a look of pure, unadulterated venom. Judge Lincoln, a stern-faced man with silver hair and a notorious reputation for zero tolerance of courtroom theatrics, took the bench. He struck his heavy wooden gavel, and the room instantly fell silent. Carter's lawyer, a slick, aggressive man in a pinstripe suit, stood up for his opening statement. He paced the floor aggressively, pointing a perfectly manicured, accusing finger directly at me. "Your Honor," the lawyer boomed, his voice filling the room. "We are here today to protect an elderly, vulnerable woman from a calculated, cold-blooded predator. Joshua was taken into this loving family out of the absolute goodness of their hearts. They gave him a home. They gave him a name. And how does he repay them? By manipulating a sick, dying woman into signing away her family's rightful legacy. He is a parasite, Your Honor. A bitter, jealous man who preyed on Mrs. Beatrice's fragile mental state to steal an inheritance that was never, ever meant for him." I sat perfectly still at the defense table. I didn't flinch. I didn't lower my eyes. I let him talk. I let them paint their elaborate masterpiece of lies, knowing exactly what was sitting in the boxes at my feet. "We have medical experts who will testify that the heavy medication Mrs. Beatrice was taking severely impaired her judgment," the lawyer continued confidently. "We demand the new will be completely invalidated and the estate returned to its rightful heirs." He sat down, looking extremely pleased with himself. Elizabeth reached over and gently patted Carter's hand, offering a fake, trembling smile to the gallery. Judge Lincoln looked over the rim of his glasses at our table. "Mr. David, the floor is yours." David stood up slowly. He didn't pace. He didn't raise his voice. He simply picked up a massive, thick binder and carried it over to the judge's bench, placing it down with a heavy thud. "Your Honor," David began, his voice calm and lethal, "my opposing counsel claims my client is a thief. We are not here to debate that accusation, because we have actual, documented proof of theft, just not by my client." David opened the first binder. "First, regarding my client's mental state, I submit into evidence full cognitive evaluations conducted by 3 independent, board-certified neurologists, a mere 48 hours before the will was signed. Mrs. Beatrice is of entirely sound mind. The will is ironclad." Carter's lawyer jumped out of his chair. "Objection! We haven't had time to review." "Overruled," Judge Lincoln snapped, flipping through the medical documents. "Proceed, Mr. David." "Now, Your Honor." David turned slowly to face my family. "Let's talk about the real reason why Mrs. Beatrice changed her will. I submit into evidence the complete financial records of the Joshua Trust Fund, established 30 years ago with $600,000 for the sole, exclusive benefit of Joshua. Matthew's face lost all its color. He gripped the edge of the heavy wooden table so hard his knuckles turned stark white. Elizabeth let out a tiny, high-pitched gasp, her hand flying to her throat. The plaintiffs, Matthew and Elizabeth, were the legally appointed executors. David continued mercilessly, pulling out more documents. Over 20 years, they systematically embezzled the entire $600,000. They used it to fund luxury European vacations, massive home renovations, and their biological son's private education. The courtroom erupted into loud murmurs. Reporters in the back row started typing frantically on their laptops and phones. "That's a lie," Carter shouted, jumping out of his chair, his face red with fury. "Mr. Carter, sit down and be quiet," Judge Lincoln barked, slamming his gavel hard. David didn't miss a single beat. He pulled out the final piece of paper. "I draw the court's attention to Exhibit D, a single withdrawal of $92,000 made on Carter's 16th birthday. Attached is the official bill of sale for a Porsche 911, purchased with the money meant to feed, clothe, and educate an orphan child." Silence slammed into the courtroom like a physical weight. Every single person stared at my family. They looked like they had just been hit by a freight train. "We call our first witness," David said smoothly. "Maria Fernandez." The side doors opened, and Maria, our old housekeeper, walked slowly to the stand. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore in, looking directly at Elizabeth with a gaze of pure steel. "Maria," David asked, standing by the podium, "can you describe to the court how Joshua was treated in that house?" "Like a stray dog," Maria said clearly into the microphone. Her voice trembled slightly, but she didn't look away. "He slept in the damp basement. He wore Carter's rags. I watched them buy Carter expensive cars and Rolex watches, while Joshua walked to school in the snow with holes in his shoes. Every time Joshua asked for anything, Mrs. Elizabeth told him to be grateful he had a roof he was unknowingly paying for with his dead parents' money. Carter completely lost his mind. His carefully crafted facade shattered into a million pieces. His face turned deep purple. He lunged across the defense table toward Maria, pointing a shaking finger. "You lying old bat. I'll ruin you. You work for us." Bailiffs rushed forward immediately, grabbing Carter by the arms and physically pinning him back into his heavy wooden chair. He was thrashing, screaming obscenities, completely destroying his own golden boy image right in front of the judge and the national press. Judge Lincoln slammed his gavel repeatedly, his face dark with fury. "Order! Order in this court. One more outburst like that, and I will hold you in contempt and have you dragged to a holding cell." The judge turned his furious, disgusted eyes to Matthew and Elizabeth, who were literally shrinking into their leather seats. David looked back at me. He nodded slightly. It was my turn. I stood up. My knees didn't shake. My voice didn't waver. I looked directly at the people who had terrorized me for 3 decades. "I am not here to steal," I said, my voice ringing clear and steady through the massive chamber. "For 30 years, I have been completely invisible in the only home I ever had. I was mocked, starved of affection, and told daily that I was a burden. All the while, the very money my parents left to protect me was stolen to buy their biological son a life of luxury. I didn't want Beatrice's money. I only ever wanted the truth. Today, I ask only this, that I finally be seen as someone worthy of justice." The courtroom was dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. I sat down, taking Beatrice's frail, cold hand in mine. This is a moment that changed everything, when I finally regained control of my life. Thank you for your patience in getting this far. You are amazing. Please help me like the video and leave a comment with the number 1 below so I know you've been with me this far. This will not only help more people find this story, but also let me know that my experiences are meaningful to someone. Your support is the biggest motivation for me to continue sharing the rest of this journey. We waited in heavy silence as Judge Lincoln spent the next 20 minutes reviewing the towering stack of bank records, wire transfers, and forged documents David had provided. The ticking of the large clock on the courtroom wall sounded like a slow heartbeat. Finally, Judge Lincoln took off his reading glasses. He laid them carefully on the bench. He looked down at the plaintiff's table with an expression of profound, unmasked disgust. "In my 30 years on the bench," Judge Lincoln began, his deep voice echoing loudly, "I have rarely seen a case of such calculated, repulsive greed, to take in an orphan child under the guise of charity, only to systematically rob him of his rightful inheritance to fund your own lavish, superficial lifestyle, is utterly despicable." Matthew was staring blankly at the floor, his shoulders slumped. Elizabeth was crying for real this time, her heavy makeup running down her face in ugly black streaks. Carter sat completely frozen, his arrogant posture gone, his reality utterly shattered. "The court finds the medical evaluations of Mrs. Beatrice to be completely sound," Judge Lincoln declared loudly. "The lawsuit to invalidate the will is dismissed with prejudice. The estate remains entirely with Joshua." He picked up a heavy black pen. "Furthermore, regarding the undeniable theft of the trust fund, I am ordering Matthew and Elizabeth to immediately repay the misappropriated $600,000 to Joshua. And because this fraud spans 2 entire decades, I am applying the maximum allowable compound interest and severe punitive damages. The plaintiffs are ordered to pay the defendant a total of $1.8 million. This case is closed." The heavy wooden gavel slammed down with a resounding crack. It was over. The sound of that gavel hitting the wood was like a thunderclap that finally cleared the dark sky above me. Matthew collapsed forward onto the table, burying his head in his arms. He knew they didn't have $1.8 million in liquid cash. They lived entirely on high-interest credit and fake appearances. This ruling meant they would lose the massive house, the luxury cars, the country club memberships. They were financially ruined. Elizabeth wailed loudly, a guttural sound of genuine, selfish despair. I just sat there. I breathed in a deep, long lungful of air, and for the absolute first time in my 32 years on this earth, it didn't feel like I was choking on dust. The courtroom cleared out quickly, buzzing with the frantic whispers of reporters. David gathered our thick files into his leather briefcase, shaking my hand with a tight, proud smile. I stood up, walked behind Beatrice's wheelchair, and prepared to push her out. Before we could reach the center aisle, a desperate hand grabbed my suit sleeve. I turned around. It was Elizabeth. Her eyes were red, swollen, and wild. Her expensive designer dress looked suddenly wrinkled and cheap. Matthew stood right behind her, looking 10 years older and frilier than I had ever seen him. "Joshua, please," Elizabeth begged, her voice cracking in desperation. "Please, honey, you can't do this to us. If you enforce that massive judgment, we lose the house. We lose absolutely everything. We're your parents. We raised you. We put a roof over your head." The sheer audacity of her using that specific phrase, "a roof over your head," after everything that had just been exposed in public record, triggered something deep inside me. But I didn't yell. I didn't lose my temper. I didn't give them the satisfaction of my anger. I looked at her with complete, icy, unwavering indifference. "You didn't raise me, Elizabeth," I said quietly, my voice devoid of any warmth. "You housed me because it was profitable. That roof you always threw in my face? I paid for it. That Porsche Carter drove to his parties? I paid for it. Every single bite of cheap food I ate in that basement, I paid for with the money my dead parents left me." "Son, please," Matthew croaked, reaching out a shaking, pathetic hand. I stepped back, entirely out of his reach. "I am not your son. I never was. And from this second forward, I never want to see either of your faces again. Do not call me. Do not email me. Speak only to my lawyer." I turned my back on them forever. I grabbed the handles of Beatrice's wheelchair and pushed her down the center aisle, leaving them standing entirely alone in the empty courtroom, drowning in the massive, inescapable mess they had created for themselves. When the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom pushed open, we were instantly blinded by the rapid flashes of cameras. The very same reporters who had called me a gold digger just days ago were now aggressively shouting questions, asking for a statement about the shocking embezzlement revelation. Microphones were shoved toward my face. I didn't stop walking. I didn't give them a single quote. I kept my back straight, my head held incredibly high, and walked Beatrice straight to the waiting black town car. I didn't need to explain myself to the media anymore. The truth was public record now. My dignity wasn't up for debate. As I helped Beatrice into the comfortable leather seat of the car, she squeezed my hand weakly, but with immense purpose. "You did it, Joshua," she whispered, her eyes shining with absolute pride. "No," I replied, looking at the bright city skyline as the car smoothly pulled away from the courthouse. "We did it." The morning after the trial, the world woke up to a completely different story. For weeks, the tabloids had painted me as a manipulative monster, a greedy adopted son who had swooped in to steal an old woman's fortune. But the courtroom transcripts were now public record. The undeniable proof of the $600,000 theft, the fraudulent trust fund documents, and the bill of sale for Carter's Porsche were plastered across every major news network and local paper. The narrative flipped overnight. The very same reporters who had camped outside my apartment to yell accusations were now leaving apologetic voicemails, begging for an exclusive interview. My lawyer, David, fielded dozens of calls an hour. I told him to decline almost all of them. I had absolutely no desire to become a reality television star or a public spectacle. I didn't want to drag my life through the mud just for ratings. But Chloe, the public relations expert Aunt Beatrice had hired, sat me down in the estate's massive library. She looked at me with a serious expression and explained that if I remained completely silent, the public would eventually fill the void with their own assumptions. She told me I had a rare opportunity to take control of my own life story, not just for my sake, but for the sake of anyone else who had ever been made to feel like a worthless burden in their own home. I agreed to exactly one live national television interview. I walked into the television studio 3 days later. The bright, hot lights of the set beamed down on me. I sat in a comfortable leather chair across from a veteran journalist known for her hard-hitting but fair approach. As the cameras started rolling and the red on-air light flashed, I felt a familiar knot of anxiety in my stomach. For 30 years, my family had controlled my voice. They told me what to say, how to act, and exactly how little space I was allowed to occupy. Speaking my truth in front of millions of people felt like stepping off a cliff. The host started by asking about the shocking amount of money my adoptive parents had stolen. She asked how it felt to win the massive $1.8 million settlement. I looked directly into the camera lens. I didn't smile, but I wasn't angry either. I felt completely grounded. The hardest part of this entire fight was never about the inheritance, I said, my voice steady and echoing through the quiet studio. The money was just the physical proof of a much deeper betrayal. The real agony was living every single day under a roof where I was never, ever treated as a human being, let alone a son. Every day was a calculated reminder that I was an outsider. I was told to be grateful for the basic necessities of life, while the funds meant to secure my future were secretly drained to fund their biological son's luxury lifestyle. The host leaned forward, clearly captivated. The studio audience was dead silent. "This ruling doesn't just return stolen money," I continued. "It restores my dignity. And I am speaking out today not to publicly shame Matthew and Elizabeth. They have done a fine job of doing that to themselves. I am speaking out for every child in the foster system, every adopted kid, and anyone who has ever been told they are less valuable because they don't share the same blood. Your worth is not determined by the people who fail to love you. You are enough exactly as you are." The interview lasted 20 minutes. When it ended, the studio audience erupted into a massive standing ovation. People were actually crying. The response over the next few weeks was absolutely overwhelming. Letters and emails poured into David's law office by the thousands. They came from older folks who had survived toxic family dynamics, from former foster children who had lived for years in the shadows, from men and women who recognized their own hidden pain in my story. They all echoed the exact same sentiment. Thank you for saying what we could not. Thank you for standing up to the bullies in your own house. I walked out of that studio with my shoulders feeling lighter than they had in 3 decades. The heavy, suffocating chain that Elizabeth and Matthew had wrapped around my neck was finally gone. The past hadn't changed, but it no longer controlled my future. I had claimed my story for what it truly was, and I refused to be silent ever again. But beneath the massive public victory and the media storm, a deeply private, quiet reality was settling in. Aunt Beatrice was fading. The pancreatic cancer was aggressive and entirely unforgiving. Her steps grew slower, her breaths became shallower, and her strong, commanding body grew more fragile with each passing sunset. I took a leave of absence from my job. I packed a suitcase and moved into the guest bedroom at her estate. I spent every single day at her bedside. We didn't talk much about the trial or the money. We talked about her youth. We talked about books, history, and the simple beauty of the gardens outside her window. I read to her in the quiet afternoons, the smell of her favorite lavender sachets filling the warm air of the room. She slept often, her chest rising and falling in slow, labored rhythms. But whenever her sharp blue eyes opened, they still glimmered with that fierce, protective fire that had fueled her voice in the courtroom. One late evening, the house was completely silent except for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. The rain was gently tapping against the glass panes of her bedroom window. I was sitting in the armchair next to her bed, reading a novel under the dim glow of a reading lamp. Beatrice slowly reached out from under the heavy wool blankets. Her fingers were incredibly cool to the touch, her skin thin as paper. I immediately set my book down and gently took her hand in mine. "Joshua," she whispered. Her voice was thin, barely a rasp, but her tone was entirely unshaken. "I'm right here, Aunt Beatrice," I said, leaning closer so she wouldn't have to strain. "Never let them define you," she said, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that burned right through my soul. "You are my legacy. Do you hear me? Not because of the property I've left you, not because of the bank accounts, but because you finally found the strength to stand up and fight when they wanted to keep you silent in the dark." Tears slid down my cheeks. I didn't try to wipe them away. I leaned closer, inhaling the familiar, comforting scent of her silver hair. "I will carry your words with me for the rest of my life," I whispered back, my voice thick with emotion. "I will honor you not with the money, but with the life I am going to build." She smiled. It was a soft, peaceful, entirely satisfied smile. She closed her eyes, her breathing settling into a slow, rhythmic pattern. A few nights later, while the house was quiet and still, Beatrice slipped away in her sleep. Her face was serene, completely free of pain, and her hand was still loosely curled around mine. The grief that tore through my chest that morning was raw and profound. I had finally found the mother figure I had spent my entire life searching for, only to lose her just as quickly. But beneath the heavy, crushing weight of the grief, something much stronger pulsed in my veins. It was the unshakable truth that she had left me far more than financial wealth. She had given me a universe of strength, the ultimate permission to exist, and the power to live a life defined not by my adoptive family's cruelty, but by my own fierce resilience. We held a private funeral for her on a crisp, sunny Tuesday morning. It was small, dignified, and beautiful. David, Chloe, Maria the housekeeper, and a few of Beatrice's oldest, dearest friends were in attendance. Matthew, Elizabeth, and Carter were legally barred from the grounds by a strict restraining order I had filed the week prior. As I stood by her polished mahogany casket, listening to the minister read her favorite scriptures, I didn't feel broken. I felt incredibly grateful. I was finally ready to face the rest of my life. A full year passed. The seasons changed, the media frenzy died down, and the world moved on to the next major headline. But for the people involved in that courtroom, the consequences of that day set our lives on entirely different, irreversible trajectories. The universe has a fascinating way of balancing the scales. You can only build a castle on the broken backs of others for so long before the foundation violently crumbles beneath you. Matthew and Elizabeth's carefully curated empire of lies completely collapsed. The judge's order to repay the $1.8 million in stolen trust funds and punitive damages was an absolute death sentence to their fake wealthy lifestyle. They had no liquid cash. They had spent it all on luxury goods, vacations, and funding Carter's massive ego. To satisfy the court order and pay their own mountain of aggressive lawyer fees, they were forced to liquidate everything. The bank foreclosed on the massive suburban mansion where I had spent 30 years living in a damp basement. The luxury cars were sold. The expensive country club revoked their membership due to unpaid dues and the sheer public embarrassment of the scandal. Today, Matthew and Elizabeth live in a cramped, two-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. They have no social circle left. The friends they tried so hard to impress abandoned them the second the money dried up. As for Carter, his descent was even steeper. Stripped of his parents' endless financial backing and permanently removed from Beatrice's inheritance, his reality shattered. He couldn't maintain his lavish lifestyle. He defaulted on massive credit card debts. The bank sent a repo man to tow away his precious midnight blue Porsche right out of his driveway in the middle of the day. Without the money to fund their luxurious lifestyle, his wife quickly filed for a brutal divorce, taking half of whatever pitiful assets he had left. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, I was sitting at my desk, reviewing some paperwork, when an email popped into my personal inbox. I didn't recognize the address at first, but when I opened it, the signature at the bottom made my stomach tighten. It was from Carter. The email was a long, rambling, pathetic wall of text. He blamed his parents for everything. He claimed he was a victim of their manipulation too. He talked about how hard his life had become, how the divorce was destroying him, and how he was struggling to pay for basic groceries. The final paragraph was a desperate, groveling plea for forgiveness, heavily disguised as a request for a small financial loan between brothers to help him get back on his feet. I stared at the screen for a long time. The old Joshua would have felt a pang of guilt. The old Joshua would have tried to save him. But I simply moved my mouse, clicked the delete button, and permanently erased the message from my trash folder. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no malice, just a profound, peaceful indifference. They had destroyed themselves with their own unchecked greed. I didn't need to push them down. Gravity did all the work. Instead of dwelling on their misery, I focused every ounce of my energy on the promise I had made to Aunt Beatrice. I took a large portion of the recovered settlement money and combined it with the massive inheritance. I purchased a beautiful modern glass building in the heart of the city. We gutted it, renovated it, and opened the doors to the Beatrice Foundation. It is a comprehensive charity and legal advocacy group entirely dedicated to protecting foster children, orphans, and adopted youth who have been cast aside, financially abused, or neglected by the system. We provide aggressive legal representation to ensure their rights are protected. We fund therapy programs, mentorships, and most importantly, we establish a secure, untouchable college fund for every single kid who comes through our doors, guaranteeing that no one can ever steal their future the way mine was stolen. Walking through the brightly lit halls of the foundation on our opening day was the proudest moment of my life. The walls were lined with vibrant photographs of smiling, hopeful children. Christopher, the incredibly passionate director of our local partner orphanage, stood at the podium and delivered a speech that left not a single dry eye in the room. He talked about how these funds would literally alter the course of hundreds of lives. The media covered the opening. But this time, the headlines didn't label me as the adopted son chasing a fortune, or the victim of a greedy family. I was written about as a leader, a man who took the darkest, ugliest parts of his past and forged them into a weapon for good. A prominent financial magazine even ran a feature on the foundation, calling me the man who turned decades of pain into a permanent legacy of hope. Later that evening, long after the guests had left and the staff had gone home, I walked out onto the private balcony of my top-floor office. The crisp Portland air filled my lungs. The sun was just beginning to set, painting the sky in brilliant, sweeping strokes of orange, gold, and deep violet. I leaned against the glass railing, looking down at the bustling city below. I thought about the frightened, shivering boy who used to walk 3 miles in the freezing rain with holes in his shoes. I thought about the man who sat quietly at a restaurant table, swallowing his humiliation to pay a $3,270 bill for people who despised him. They felt like strangers to me now. I remembered Aunt Beatrice's voice, echoing softly in the back of my mind. I finally understood the absolute truth of her wisdom. The sweetest, most satisfying revenge in this world isn't about destroying the people who hurt you. It's not about watching them suffer. The sweetest revenge is taking the broken pieces they left behind and building a massive, beautiful, undeniable life that they never, ever believed you were capable of living. And as I watched the final rays of the sun dip below the city skyline, I knew in my heart that I had done exactly that. Looking back on this entire 30-year journey, the biggest lesson I learned isn't about money, and it isn't about the legal system. It's about the fundamental definition of family and self-worth. For so long, I allowed toxic people to dictate my values simply because they provided a roof over my head. I believed that because I was adopted, I owed them a debt of eternal suffering and silence. But the truth is, respect and love are never supposed to be conditional transactions. If someone requires you to shrink yourself, to hide your light, or to accept constant disrespect just to earn your place at their table, then that is not your table. You have the absolute right to stand up, walk away, and build your own table with people who actually value your presence. Never let anyone use your past or your circumstances to keep you in a basement, metaphorically or literally. Your worth is inherent. It belongs to you, and no one has the authority to take it away unless you hand them the pen to write your story. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic environment or family member to finally find your own peace? What was the hardest part for you? Share your favorite takeaway or your own story in the comments below. Or, if you simply agree that our worth is built by our own hands, just drop the word "good" in the comments so I know this message resonated with you. Thank you for listening, and remember to always protect your peace.